Good evening, everyone, and sorry for the delay. On behalf of Godrej Archives, the Museum Society of Mumbai, and CSMVS, I welcome you all to the 7th Thursday talk. And before we begin, let me quickly inform you about Godrej Archives. Godrej started mulling over the idea of setting up an archive way back in 1997, when Godrej was celebrating centenary. With the motto of Restore, Reflect, Reimagine, Godrej Archives helps the organization with collecting, storage, and conservation of its historically important records using state-of-the-art standards and practices. It regularly holds exhibitions, lectures such as these, and workshops to generate awareness about the organization's history and the presentation of India's corporate heritage. Godrej Archives has also instituted an annual lecture series to make people appreciate the value of archives and popularize the subject of business history. And I'm really happy to inform that we are once again planning to host an in-person offline annual lecture after almost 3 years on 2nd March. But we'll keep holding these online talks as well. And we are once again happy to collaborate with the Museum Society and the CSMVS for our Thursday talk series. Now I would like to call upon Dr. Firoza Godrej, Chairperson of the Museum Society of Mumbai and Chairperson of the Godrej Archives Council, to address the gathering and introduce the speaker. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Brinda. And may I add my own welcome to you, Karuna. We're delighted you accepted the Godrej Archives invitation. A few words about the Museum Society of Mumbai, who we turned 60 last year, and our museum celebrates its centenary this year. The society is an NGO, and we're all volunteers at this society under the auspices of the CSMVS, which is the leading institute for museology in our city of Mumbai. On behalf of the trustees, the chairman, the director general, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, members of the Museum Society of Mumbai, and on my own behalf as chairman of the Museum Society, Karuna, a very, very warm welcome to you. We are so happy that you have permitted us to place this lecture on YouTube so that those of us who have not been able to join this evening can take advantage and see the lecture and enjoy the lecture at leisure from the comfort of their home or wherever they like. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now say a few words about our speaker today, Dr. Karuna Wielenga. Karuna is a historian with a broad interest in the economic and social history of modern South Asia, currently teaching at the Azim Premji University in Bangalore. She completed her PhD at the University of Delhi. Her monograph, Weaving Histories, the Transformation of the Handloom Industry in South India, 1800 to 1960, has been published by the British Academy in association with OUP UK. The book explores the changing world of handloom weavers in South India from the early 19th to the mid-20th century, following the trajectories of different kinds of weavers and spinners. Her postdoctoral research, carried out as a Newton International Fellow at the University of Oxford, focused on the historical emergence of the informal sector in India, looking at the complex interactions and conflicts between labor, capital, and the state in a variety of industries between 1930 and 1970. Her work has been published in several international academic journals. With her book titled Weaving Histories, serving as the backdrop today, Dr. Karuna will talk about the transformation in the handloom industry of South India in the 19th and 20th century and draw out a wider implication on the Indian economy. Karuna, we are eagerly awaiting to hear the histories of artisans you have reconstructed through your research and the challenges in archiving their histories. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us, and may I now request you to address us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. thank the Godrej Archives and the Museum Society of Bombay for hosting me today, and all of you who are attending the lecture for attending on a weekday evening, taking time out for this. And apologies for the tech issues. And so I have to speak from my phone. So without wasting any time, I'll go ahead to begin my talk. Could you share the PPT? Yeah, thank you. So as was already mentioned, this talk is based on my book. And so I'll be talking particularly about one chapter of my book. And since this is being hosted by an archive, I thought it would be interesting to kind of talk about the main arguments of the book around my own experiences and challenges in the archive. I mean, the handloom industry has been written about quite a bit, and historians, unlike so many other things, it's not an ignored part of history as such. So in the existing historiography, the kind of you hear two main narratives. So the initial narrative was the narrative of the nationalists, which bemoaned the destruction of the handlooms due to the colonial impact, and this has been known as the deindustrialization thesis. Since the last few decades, there has been a more kind of revisionist history, which has kind of questioned this narrative of deindustrialization, taking as a starting point that, how come if everything was deindustrialized, that we have so many handloom weavers still around and so many different varieties of cloth still being woven. So this story of destruction doesn't really sound right. And so the revisionist historiography has kind of focused on the tenacity and the dynamism of the handloom industry in the way it kind of adapted to the impact of colonialism, of modern industrialization, and so on. So my book kind of sits in the context of this existing historiography, and what I've tried to do is kind of question this this approach, which looks at the handloom industry itself as a kind of monolith. So the focus has been, the questions have been, did the handloom industry decline, or did it revive? Did it adapt? So you're all the time talking about the industry as if it's some kind of a monolith. So the approach I've taken in the book, which kind of emerged through the process of looking at the archive, is that it makes more sense to look at the handloom industry as the different constituents of the handloom industry, so to speak, the different kind of participants in the handloom industry, and look at what happened to these different constituents. Not the same thing happened. The story of different kinds of weavers, the story of the spinners, the story of the different people who performed different accessory jobs in the handloom weaving industry differed. So all the stories were not the same. So I felt that it was important to recover these different stories within the larger narrative. So that is kind of placing my book in the existing historiography, and how it is different, how it takes a different approach, so to say. Now, there is another aspect which, which pushed me in this direction, which is that there's lot has been written about the handloom weavers and the cloths and the textiles that were produced for export. The simple reason being that that is where the documents are. So our archives are basically colonial archives of the colonial state and the different companies, the English East India Company and the other companies, and therefore the material that we have speaks about the cloths, the textiles that were exported to Europe and other parts. And therefore, the histories that have been written have been largely about the weavers who were weaving for this external market. But my interest was that, India has such a huge population. So what kind of clothing were people here wearing? What kind of textiles were being used in the domestic markets, and who were the weavers who were producing for the domestic markets? So there was a very big hole in the existing kind of historiography, and so that is what I wanted to kind of dig up. Obviously, I was faced with the challenge of, but how do I do that? I mean, given the fact that, the archives of the up till the 18th century do not talk about the interior regions, do not talk about the weavers who are weaving for the domestic market. And even in the 19th century, by the 19th century, the archives kind of stopped talking about handloom weavers because the East India Company is no more exporting cloth. Instead, cloth is being sold in the industry, mill cloth is being sold in our markets. And therefore, in the 19th century, the handloom weavers are kind of missing or hidden in the archive. So I just said, okay, let me go and explore the archive and see how am I going to do this? I mean, how am I going to reconstruct the story of weaving for the domestic market? So I plodded through a lot of Board of Revenue records in the 19th century, district records, and literally had to plod through all of them to find scattered references to weavers. So the first thing that struck me, one of the first things that struck me when I was looking at, and I basically worked on the Madras presidency. So one of the first things that struck me was that there seemed to be a lot of references to Parayar weavers. Now, many of you might be already aware that Parayar is a name of a particular caste group who are amongst the Dalit caste group in Tamil Nadu, in the south. I've grown up in Tamil Nadu and got interested because of looking at handloom industry around me. And I had never heard that, Parayars as a caste wove. Because generally, you heard other names such as Sengunda Mudaliyar or Saurashtra or Saliyar as the weaving caste, so to say. So this was a kind of surprise for me. And I kept asking people, have you heard of this? And everybody was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. That's surprising. And when it came to the Deccan districts, I kept reading that Malas, who are another Dalit caste, were also weaving. So then I went back to the historiography and existing historiography. And there I noticed that many historians have in passing mentioned the Parayar weavers or the Mala weavers, but it has always been as a kind of exception, right? Yes, there were a few Parayar weavers or there were a few Mala weavers, and they are mostly part-time weavers who wove kind of coarse cloth. So in general, the focus was on weaving castes who were identified as full-time, professional, artisanal weavers, right? And so this intrigued me because when I looked at the records, it looked like, they are not there in small numbers. And I will show some of these records later in the talk. So this was something that kind of struck me and rung a bell. And I said, hey, I really must, interrogate this and look into it. Now, another thing while working in the archives, I stumbled upon was the company paintings. Now, the company paintings, can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, okay. I hope this is visible. So here are a list of the different kinds of sources that I have used. So and I will go through them one by one. So the company paintings are paintings which were commissioned by colonial officers who, in those days, there were no cameras, right? So this is before the time of cameras, and who wanted to kind of document the Oriental life, and also wanted to send it back, to to Britain for people to see how did Indian life look like. And so they commissioned these series of paintings. So I'm not going into who painted them. There's quite a bit written about the style of painting and who the painters were and all that. So these series kind of often documented different castes, because caste was seen as one of these defining characteristics of Indian society. And so, they were basically paintings of couples, and often they were made to hold the kind of implements that they used in the whatever work they were doing. And they were in series. So usually there were some 18 or 20 or more couples doing from different walks of life documented in these series. And so I found that this visual record might be interesting in recapturing what kind of clothes people wore. I mean, what kind of textiles were used before going to who produced them. One needs to find out what did people wear, what were the kind of cloths that were used. So I kind of looked at several series and analyzed several series of these company paintings in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And another interesting source which I found, which I thought would again help me reconstruct this picture, were the textile samples. Can we go to the next couple of slides? I just wanted to show some of these company paintings just to give you an idea. You can go to the Victoria and Albert Museum website, and you can see many of these company paintings. So as you can see, I mean, so these are 3 couples, but then there are also always individual couples. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the first slide also actually showed, I don't know whether you saw that, potters at work. So this is just to give you an idea of the kind of company paintings which I use, which I analyzed more systematically to kind of see. The kind of analysis that I did was how many people wore white cloth, how many people wore colored cloths, or were the cloths with borders, without borders, what seemed to be the texture of the cloth, and so on. So it was more about trying to figure out what kind of cloths people used. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the other source, as I was saying, that I found interesting and decided to use was what's known as the Forbes Watson collection. So the Forbes Watson collection, can you go to the next slide, please? Was a collection made by this gentleman called John Forbes Watson, where he collected, samples of cloth made across the country in order to kind of make a kind of mobile museum and sample book, so to say, because there were a lot of complaints that, the milk cloth that is being made in England is not being sold is not selling in the domestic markets because people don't find them of the right dimension or of the right design. So there was a demand that, if we make a kind of sample book, then the mills can reproduce them. So if you look at these samples, again, there is a very good website which has digitized all of this. It gives you the dimensions of all the kind of cloth samples. It tells you exactly how many meters, etc. It tells you about the texture of the cloth. It tells you where the cloth was bought, how much it costs, and so on. So this was very useful for me to kind of reconstruct what was worn. But interestingly, because Forbes Watson was trying to look for different patterns, he was interested in collecting as many patterns as possible, right? And not necessarily something that was representative of how much it was used. So here I couldn't depend on this collection to reconstruct the quantity of the different cloths that were produced. Can you please go back to the previous slide? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so these are just 2 quotes from the Forbes Watson's report, which accompanied the collection, which shows that most of the cloth that was worn by people was coarse, unbleached, and it was called by different names. and one prominent name was Khadi, right? Especially in South India. So the word Khadi, interestingly, comes from this history. So though he has only a very few samples of this kind of khadi or coarse cloth, in quantity, he records that, this was used in huge quantities. And this was also confirmed by my analysis of the company paintings, which also again showed that most people, interestingly, wore either white or unbleached cloth, with, often simple kind of embellishment in the form of a border, or the ends of the cloth would have some kind of small pattern. And this is again something that Forbes Watson notes in his report. He says, often there is not too much patterning, but the cloth is made beautiful by just a simple border or some kind of pattern at the end of the cloth. Can you please go to the next slide? Yeah, so here is an example of, this coarse kind of khadi, coarse cloth with very little bit of embellishment in the form of a border or at the ends, right? And the next slide again. Yeah, and here are a few more examples. So basically, the analysis of both these two kinds of sources showed that, a lot of people, or maximum number of people, seem to be wearing coarse, strong, durable kind of cloths with very little embellishment. Now, this goes against our vision, our image of handlooms, right? The moment we think about handlooms, we are thinking about exquisite weaves and silk sarees and highly patterned, kind of intricately patterned kind of textiles and all that. So this is not to say that those kind of textiles did not exist. Of course, they existed, and they represented the fantastic skills of weavers. But in centering these kind of exquisite cloths, we often forget that, most of the cloth that people wore and was woven were very ordinary kinds of cloth, where the importance was about its durability and, simple design. And these kinds of cloth were produced all across the country by a variety of weavers. And I will come to that. Can you please go to the next slide? Yeah, so these are just two slides to show you the more exquisite kind of. So the one on the left is the kind of typical red tie and dye sari with golden border, which was woven in, Madurai, which is where I come from, was an important center. And this was woven especially by the Saurashtra weavers, who play a part in my story in the book. Yeah, next slide, please. So this story, but had to be, so far, I was able to reconstruct part of the story, but this had to, as you know, historians always have to strengthen their argument. And okay, I had an impression, so to say, from paintings and textile samples, but I needed, further evidence to reconstruct who were weaving cloths and what kind of cloths. So as I said, I had to trawl the archive, so to say, to come up with a lot of scattered data which had to be collated. So this table, for example, is taken from a report in the early 19th century, 1804 actually, of the ceded districts. So just after the Nizam had ceded some of his districts to the company, and just after that, actually Munro, the official Munro, goes and surveys the area and gives this report. So this is just a sample. The report is a huge report with, going to pages and pages with details. So, but this gives you, as you can see what kinds of cloth. So Brahmin cloth, Patel women's cloth, Shela muslins, turbans, etc., rumals, khadis, mota sari, women's cloth, right? So, the spelling is all a little strange, but that's because that's how it is in the documents. So all these details as to, and the punjams, which is given there, is about how fine or coarse the cloth was. And then there are the number of looms which were weaving that kind of cloth, and then the amount of cloth that was produced. Can you please go to the next slide? Yeah, so this one and the next one, I mean, this is just to give you an impression, right, of the way I kind of calculated the amount of cloth that was woven. And I mean, without you having to analyze the tables, I'll give you some of the conclusions that I came to after analyzing not just these tables, but a lot of similar kind of data. Can you please go to the next slide? So here are the main conclusions. This is the main conclusion about this particular table of the seeded districts, right? So 83% of the looms produced white cloth or unbleached cloth. It's not clear. Sometimes it's unbleached cloth. And if you calculate it in terms of value, so the first is in terms of number of looms, and the second is in terms of value, then 72% of the value of total cloth produced was white or unbleached, right? And the single cloth category that accounted for the largest number of looms was khadi, the coarsest kind of cloth, right? And the other category was mota sarees, which was kind of the same as khadi, but it was coarse white sarees woven for women. So as you can see, this also showed that enormous amounts of cloth that were produced were of the durable, coarse, unpatterned, unbleached kind of cloth, which was very, very widely used. Can you please go to the next slide? Yeah, so then this raises the question as to, who produced these different kinds of cloth. I mean, in my book, I kind of also talk about the whole links between, cotton cultivation, between spinning, weaving, and then the finishing processes and the markets. Unfortunately, there's no time to go into those details right now. But here you can see from this table that, there were a lot of different communities, castes that wove cloth. And these kind of tables, again, this kind of information is there in the archives, scattered, again, had to be trawled and kind of collated and put together. And so this is a kind of sample table from the district of Madurai. Now here you can see, so Kaikolar, the first one, Kaikolar are the people who later come to be called the Sengunda Mudaliyars, and then the Parayar, the Shaniyar, the Saidar, the Saliyar, Ilavar, and Labbai. So all these communities are shown as weaving, and you can see from the number of looms that different communities had different numbers. But what is very striking here is the percentage of the Parayar. Now, as I already said, the Kaikolar and the Pattanulkarar, sorry, I left the Pattanulkarar in the beginning because Madurai is known mostly for the Saurashtra weavers who were earlier called the Pattanulkarar. So now you can see that they made up 20% of the number of looms. And the Kaikolar were also present to only 7.13% in the district of Madurai, but the Parayar are shown as 48%, right? So this is the kind of information that struck me, right? Can you please go to the next table? Next slide. Yeah, so here is the is another district of Coimbatore, and again you will see that together with the Jaddars, who actually later come to be so the Jaddars and the Kaikolars, the Jaddars are now known as the Devangars. So along with the Jaddars and the Kaikolars, the largest number comes from the Parayar. So the others are recognized weaving castes, whereas the Parayars are not recognized as weaving castes. So so collating this kind of information brought to the fore the composition of the different communities that produced cloth. Now, to reconstruct what kinds of cloth were produced by whom, I had to rely on qualitative in qualitative information. And through that reconstruction, what came to light was that, yes, there were specialist weavers who wove, silk and patterned kind of cloths. For example, women's sarees were often woven by a cluster of villages who specialized in that, right? Similarly, silk weaving or cotton silk weaving was again done by specialized weaving groups. But as I said, most of the cloth was not specialized kind of cloth. And these cloths were produced by almost all of these weavers, especially the kaikolars and the parayars and the saliers. And they all produced very similar kinds of cloth. Yeah, so they all produce very similar kinds of cloth. And my further research kind of, so my next question, okay, these are the people who are producing these kinds of cloth. In what kind of systems of production were they embedded, was my next question. So in this, what I kind of was able to reconstruct was that they were embedded in different kinds of production systems. So one of the quite prevalent systems was, getting yarn from farmers or from farmers' families, weaving the cloth and returning it to them in exchange for a wage, right? And this was a system that was especially prevalent in the cotton producing regions. So if you take the whole of the Deccan region, where the black cotton soils and where cotton is produced, almost every household spun cotton, and it was the women of the household who spun cotton. And this yarn, I mean, except for the Brahmin households, almost every household, the women spun yarn. And this yarn was then often given in the Deccan to the mala weavers and to other weavers to be made into cloth, and then for which they were paid a wage. Now, even in the non-cotton producing regions, it was very common for women to go to the market to purchase cotton in small quantities, bring it home, spin it, and either sell that yarn again in the local market, or sell it or give it to weavers to be converted into cloth. Now, this kind of cloth came to be categorized as home cloth, homemade cloth, by the colonial officials. And how did I find this in the archive? Because there was a huge discussion about customs and, about taxing or paying customs for cloth that crossed district borders. Now, when initially there were a lot of exemptions, and when the state tried introducing systems whereby they could collect more customs, there was a kind of objection, or there was a hue and cry about taxing cloth which was of a value less than, say, 1 rupee or 2 rupees, or taxing these so-called homemade cloths, because earlier they were exempted. And so it is through this, conflict about the customs that, this story about homemade cloths comes out, and where then there are reports which say that, almost 80% of the cloth, there are huge quantities. Here I don't have the figures, but it is there in the book, the extent of cloth that is produced in this manner. Right. So the extent of cloth produced in this manner was huge. Now, the other way that many weavers got yarn was by going to the markets and buying yarn in different quantities, or by tying up with spinners, because often when you weave a particular kind of cloth, you need at least yarn from 4 spinners. You need that much yarn to be able to weave, and you need then yarn of the same thickness, right? You can't have yarn of different thickness. So often, especially the finer cloths, the weavers tied up with specific spinners to get uniform qualities of yarn. So either, they bought directly from the spinners, or they bought from the markets where the spinners themselves came to sell yarn, or they bought from yarn merchants. Now, an interesting factor here, which I think has an important impact on the structure of the handloom production, was that the cotton merchants were different from the yarn merchants who were different from the final cloth merchants, right? They were not the one and the same person. Okay, and I will come back to this point a little later. Continuing the story about the different kinds of production systems. One was, this kind of direct production. The other was buying yarn from the market and selling cloth to the same market, or selling it to merchants, itinerant merchants, or other merchants and traders. And then there were more sophisticated systems whereby the merchant gave you an advance. The finer the cloth, the more sophisticated the cloth, the more you needed an advance to be able to get the necessary raw materials. And so in those cases, the merchants were involved in giving the advance and often and taking the cloth back, paying a wage for the cloth that was made. But the yarn, etc., was still bought or sourced by the weaver themselves. And this was important, and this is different from the putting out system, say in Europe, where, the weavers got the yarn and so did not, could not make the choice, did not have the freedom to kind of determine which yarn they bought, so in all of that, then the margin that you could make differed. And there was more independence in you being in control of the raw materials. So as you can see, there were very different systems of production. There were different kinds of castes that were involved. And this is what gets transformed in the 19th century. So my first challenge was to reconstruct the early 19th century handloom landscape, so to say, before I could look at how it was transformed and why it was transformed. And so going back to my first point, which was that that I felt that there was a need to look at what happened to different kinds of weavers and spinners in the process. This reconstruction was very important, and that is what actually made me look at them as different actors, because already so many people who were earlier hidden from the story or were not visible in the story, such as the Parayar weavers or the different kinds of spinners. Again, spinners are usually, they are absent from the story, and these are the women who are absolutely central to spinning, and also to the other processes such as the carding of the cleaning of the can you please go to the next slide? Yeah. The next slide, please. There's one more slide. Yeah. So, these are just images to show that all the work, though this weaving itself was mostly not done by women, all the other accessory work of cleaning, spinning, warping, etc. was done by women. And they are generally absent also from the story. So the first was to reconstruct the story with visualizing the different actors in the story, so to say, before looking at what the transformation, what happened to them in the process. Now, I won't go into the details of what happened, in the detail of what all happened, because that would take too much time. But to kind of summarize my overall argument, in the process of the transformation in the 19th century, what is very striking is the disappearance of the Parayar weavers from weaving and the Mala weavers from weaving. So by the time you reach the 1930s, all these figures of 40%, 30%, 20%, depending on the district that you are looking at, they are just not there in the record. And by 1960s, the few Parayars or other kind of Dalit castes who are mentioned as new entrants to the weaving industry. So this is absolutely striking. And the second disappearance is, of course, of the women spinners. So spinning was the occupation that was hit most by the mills, and so the women also. The women spinners also disappeared from the story. Now, what happens to the rest of the different kinds of weavers? It's basically you find that the weavers, for example, like the Kaikolars, who call themselves the Sengunda Mudaliyars, who earlier was weaving almost the same kinds of cloth as the Parayars, which were the coarse, ordinary kinds of cloth. shift to weaving much more sophisticated kinds of cloth. So they shift to weaving saris, to shift to weaving patterned cloths, and later on from the 1930s onwards, weaving artificial silk, new kinds of yarn, and so on. So those who managed to make that transition to weaving, more sophisticated patterned kinds of cloth, and while doing that, managed to adapt to new kinds of technology, for example, the fly shuttle, and new kinds of warping frames, then later on the jacquard, and which then enable them to produce more sophisticated cloth at much quicker rates, with a higher productivity. They survive, right? While those who are not able to make that transition for a combination of reasons. One is the lack of social capital, the lack of economic capital. They kind of disappear from the from handloom weaving. And those who manage to make the transition also find themselves in a totally new kind of system of production. So I already described the different systems of production that existed in the early 19th century. In the 20th century, again, you don't find one kind of production. There are handloom workshops, there are small handloom factories, there is weaving at home. So again, there are a variety of production systems. However, what is common amongst them is a greater centralization of the whole production process and greater control by those, by the master weaver, the figure who comes to be called as the master weaver. So this figure of the master weaver emerges in this process. So the master weaver is kind of and the merchant is kind of the yarn merchant and the cloth merchant, and all of them made into one. So I earlier said how all these merchants were different, whereas here they kind of come to rest in the same person, and that leads to a lot of centralization of the production process. So now the raw material is controlled, the design, and the whole production process, even when it happens, say, in the individual home of the weaver, it is controlled much more centrally. And so this can be looked at from two angles. One angle is that this is what enabled the handloom industry to compete and to survive in the market by improving productivity, design, etc. On the other hand, and obviously it was possible because of the dynamism of these master weavers. But on the other hand, what happens to the majority of the weavers who are in many ways then subject to the vagaries of the market, and to low wages and having to self-exploit in order to survive, is the other side of the story, right? And in the whole process, as I already mentioned, the kind of weavers who could not make this transition obviously disappear. And apart from the larger processes such as the competition from Lancashire, the competition from Indian mills, the changes in the market, consumer tastes, and so on, caste also plays an important role in determining who makes the transition and how. And this I kind of try to show in my book by comparing what happens to the Parayar weavers to what happens, for example, to the Saurashtra weavers, who are a success story, so to say. There is a lot more in the book where I look at what the role played by the state and so on. But I think I will stop here now and just end with going back to the central theme of my talk today, which is to say that often we have to be creative in the kind of sources we look for, and in the way we interpret those sources, and also question existing perceptions on, say, who's a weaver, who are the castes who weave, and so on. So often you have to be creative in finding sources and interpreting them in order to kind of visualize the stories of people who would otherwise be invisible, right? So in the case of the handloom industry, I have given an example of right now of the story of, say, Parayar weavers and Mala weavers. But another example would be that of women spinners, right? So often they are, obviously hand spinning was obsolete, and anyway women spinners were badly paid. So often their story gets dismissed in just a few sentences or few lines. But if you look at the work of Ian Wendt, for example, he kind of tries to reconstruct the amount of labor that went into spinning and the importance of wages from spinning to the household by counting the threads and looking at how many kilometers and miles of thread were required to make a particular piece of cloth, and what was the value added to that cloth by spinning, and what contribution did that wage make to the household. So again, this is just another example of how you sometimes have to use the sources creatively in order to make visible the hidden stories, so to say. Otherwise, these are lost to history. So here, I mean, in my book, I've tried to, combine very different kinds of sources, visual sources, like the company paintings, actual material sources like the textile samples, with, a lot of scattered data in revenue reports, loom tax reports, customs reports, and so on, to track down the story of different kinds of weavers, spinners, and other people involved in the handloom industry, and what happens to them in the course of the 19th century. So, I mean, I'll stop here and wait for questions, and then if you want me to elaborate on anything, I'll be happy to do that. Thank you very much for listening.